A young girl was found dead on the floor of her apartment. The police had begun an investigation and had immediately uncovered some very disturbing facts. It turned out that the residents of this complex had long noticed something strange and lived in fear. During the investigation, the investigators learned more and more terrible details until they finally came to the unexpected truth. But it was only the beginning. Friends, after watching, recommend to subscribe to my channel. It is important for me. Stephanie Bennett was born on April 30, 1979 in Rocky Mount, Virginia. When she was little, her parents divorced and Stephanie had to live with her mom. However, their father lived near their house and the girl continued to see him almost every day. Her father later married and she had a half-sister, Diana. After high school, she enrolled at Roanoke College, 350 km from her home. In her senior year, she met a guy named Walter, and soon they started dating. After college, the couple moved to different cities, but they continued to be together. Stephanie moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, with her stepsister Diana and their mutual friend Emily. The three of them rented an apartment in a Bridgeport complex located in a quiet area on the outskirts of the city. She got a job at IBM, and her boyfriend, meanwhile, moved to Greenville, South Carolina, to get a degree in engineering. Stephanie had lived in the role for about a year, and by that time, she and her sister and friend were planning to move to different cities. The girl, who had just turned 23, was about to move to Greenville with her boyfriend. The couple had already begun to look for housing. In May, Stephanie traveled to Greenville, where she and Walter looked at several apartments and selected a suitable rental. When she returned to Raleigh, her friend and sister were no longer at home. Emily moved to another town, and Diana went away for a few days to attend the funeral. On the evening of May 20, Stephanie came home from work and called Walter. The guy was gonna fax her the lease to get the girl to sign it. They agreed that Walter would send it tomorrow afternoon when the girl could use the computer. He tried to call her the next day, but Stephanie did not answer her work or home phone. Then he called her sister, and Diana contacted her colleagues. It turned out that Stephanie did not appear in the office that day. It was very strange. The girl is always responsible for her work. If she were ill, she would definitely inform her superiors. Plus, Stephanie was supposed to be home, but the girl wasn't answering her phone. So Diana asked her friend to go to their apartment and check it out. There was no answer to the knock on the door either, and Diana had the complex manager open the door with a spare key. As soon as the man entered the apartment, he saw a terrible sight. Stephanie was lying on the floor of Emily's room without signs of life, and the manager immediately called the police. The girl had no clothes on, and there were bruises on her neck. Detectives found Stephanie's ID, and the photo confirmed that she was the victim. On the lid of Emily's laundry basket, which was under the window in Emily's bedroom, investigators noticed the leaves and concluded that the killer could have entered the apartment through a window. They also discovered that the home phone was in a storage room in Emily's room. The cable was cut. Apparently, the perp hid there and took the phone with him, so the girl couldn't use it. After talking to Diana, the police found a few things missing from the apartment. Perp took $8 from the victim's wallet and 2 tape recorders, as well as a laundry basket from Stephanie's room. Apparently, he put the stolen goods in there. Forensics found traces of cement on the victim's body and pulled a DNA sample, but it wasn't in the FBI database. They also found that the cause of death was strangulation. It is noteworthy that the perpetrator took with him the object used to strangle the girl, as the police were unable to find him in the apartment. Meanwhile, investigators canvassed the compound, hoping that someone might have seen the killer. During these conversations, the police discovered that something strange had been happening in the residential complex for several months. People regularly spotted a man who was peeping through the windows of their apartments. They complained to the manager, but the management of the complex never found him. It is noteworthy that at least once this man was seen at Stephanie's window. In addition, a girl was assaulted by an unidentified man near a lake near the compound several months ago after she went for a run. After this incident, Stephanie was afraid to stay in the apartment alone and wanted to move to Greenville as soon as possible. Detectives scoured the area around the compound and discovered something strange. In the bushes, they found several dozen specimens of women's lingerie, which later turned out to be Stephanie. The police thought the killer had taken them out of the apartment, but then dumped them in the bushes for some reason. However, this version was soon disproved, and it turned out that a teenager who lived in an apartment next door would regularly sneak into Stephanie's room and steal her underwear, then throw it into the bushes. He himself admitted this when investigators interviewed all the residents, but the young man denied involvement in the murder. His DNA was taken, and it did not match the sample from the killer's cement. This is why he was no longer suspected of the crime. The police believed that the most obvious candidate for the role of killer was the same man who repeatedly peeped at the residents of the complex through the windows. After talking to everyone who has ever noticed this man, detectives have made an approximate portrait. It was published in the newspapers, but it did not bear fruit. As part of the standard procedure, investigators checked the victim's boyfriend. He volunteered his DNA, which didn't match the killer's. Also, Walter was a few hundred miles away from her house at the time of the murder, and he couldn't have been there. The police then went around to all the male residents of the compound to ask for their DNA on a voluntary basis. This, too, yielded no results. The experts did not get a single match from the 283 samples obtained. At that point, they didn't have any solid leads. Detectives have set up surveillance on the housing complex, hopefully spotted the same man who was spying on the resident. To their surprise, very soon they did. On 3 June, the police spotted a man who had come to several windows on the ground floor and looked into the apartments. After stopping at one of the windows, the man began to satisfy himself, and the police immediately arrested him. The pervert was Christopher Lee Campen, who had been convicted of spying on several occasions and had also been convicted of stalking a woman 3 years earlier. The detectives thought they had finally caught the killer, but were disappointed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's body. He was charged with peeping, but was no longer considered a suspect for the murder. Since then, the police have continued to work on the case, but have not had a single solid lead. A year later, the lead detective heard of the existence of a lab in Florida that could identify a person's ethnicity based on their DNA. However, he had doubts about this technology, but the investigator did not want to miss this opportunity. So, as a test, he sent the DNA of 4 of his colleagues from different ethnic backgrounds. Forensics did 100%, and the detective gave them Stephanie's killer's DNA. The lab found that the person with the DNA was white, but that information didn't help the policeman. In August 2003, the victim's father offered a $100,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of the killer. Her mother wrote a letter that was published in local newspapers, begging people to share with the police any information that might lead to a suspect. All of this has led to some new leads, but they've come to nothing. In April 2004, detectives decided to re-interview all residents of the complex based on the testimony of multiple witnesses. They suggested that the man arrested for snooping might not be the only one who walked around the buildings of the complex and looked into other people's windows. Knowing the identity of the first man and holding pictures of him, the investigators wanted to talk to the residents again who noticed the peeping man. Unfortunately, none of them have ever seen his face. Most often this man appeared at night, and his head almost always had a hood. Some witnesses said they had seen him without a hood, but they could only see that he had long hair. Detectives canvassed a few dozen people before they finally got to the man who saw this man right in front of Stephanie's window before the murder. His statement was already with the police, but this time he remembered something else. The witness stated that he saw the man a few days after the incident in daylight. This man was walking his dog outside a wooded area behind a residential complex. A witness recognized him from a hoodie. He watched the man for a while until he fled into the trees with his Labrador. Apparently, the witness simply forgot about the incident or did not think it had anything to do with the murder. Therefore, the police did not receive this information during the initial interview. One thing's for sure, the detectives didn't get this information until 2 years after Stephanie died. Now they knew they were looking for a man with a Labrador. From the fact that this man was walking his dog in that area, he must have lived nearby. And here, the detectives noticed one interesting fact. Behind that wooded area, where the witness saw a man, there was another residential complex. Given that the dog's owner was headed that way, he could have been living there. The police went there and asked the staff if there were any men with a Labrador in the compound. They immediately told them the name of 35-year-old Drew Plantan and also added some interesting details. All the staff of the complex thought him a little strange. He hardly spoke to anyone, never looked other people in the eye, and in general he was very lonely. The man was very thin with long hair and constantly wore baggy clothes. Many people thought he was trying to attract as little attention as possible. Except in his case, it worked exactly the opposite. The police decided to learn more about the man and spoke to an elderly woman who, according to the officers, was watching everything that was happening in the complex. There was a very unexpected turn waiting for them when they told her that they were investigating the murder of Stephanie Bennett. The woman said, "Haven't you arrested anyone yet?" Everyone knows it was that guy with the big dog. Detectives were, to put it mildly, shocked. It took them 2 years to find this man, and the residents of his compound initially suspected this man, but none of them saw fit to share their suspicions with the police. It turns out Drew moved out of the compound and moved across town. Investigators decided to talk to him and went to his apartment, but no one responded to the knock on the door. They went there several times at different times of day and never received any answer. Either the man was never home or he deliberately wouldn't open the door for them. While they were trying to find Drew, the police were interviewing his former neighbors at his old residence. They were able to find several witnesses who shared disturbing facts. A woman who lived upstairs saw Drew in the company of a young man a few days after Stephanie's murder. They were walking down the street talking about something. According to the witness, Drew asked the young man to stop contacting the police and not tell them anything. Investigators immediately concluded that this guy was the same teenager who was stealing underwear from the victim's apartment. Several women at once said that they were seriously afraid of Drew. They noticed him while jogging or walking in deserted places. The man was watching them closely, or he was literally chasing them. Detectives who could never talk to Drew. We found his place of work and headed there. He was a chemist in a fertilizer lab. The researchers managed to catch him in the workplace. He immediately said that he had not heard about the murder of Stephanie Bennett. This turned out to be odd, considering Drew lived about a mile from her compound at the time. The man was clearly reluctant to talk to the police and told them that he was very busy at the moment. Drew told the investigators they could come to his house at the appointed time and he would answer all their questions. Detectives met him at his apartment and a man finally opened the door for them. During the conversation, he stated that he had never walked his dog near Stephanie's complex, given that the police had numerous witnesses who repeatedly saw him in the area. Investigators immediately realized that he was lying. The man also stated that he did not wear glasses, although his driving license stated that he had to wear them while driving. And several witnesses said that the man who was peeping through people's windows wore glasses. Hopefully, Drew refused to volunteer his DNA. Then the detectives decided to put a tail on him, hoping to get the sample another way. But this task proved to be very difficult, as the man did not leave behind any objects that could be passed to the laboratory. For example, on his lunch break, he would leave work and get in his car and just sit there, looking at the same spot. The man didn't eat anything, so investigators couldn't get any of his DNA. One day, they noticed Drew throwing an empty bottle of water into a dumpster. The detectives took it to the lab, but the lab couldn't get a DNA sample from it. According to one version, Drew took someone else's bottle and threw it out on purpose, knowing that he was being followed. After that, the police decided to get their hands on his garbage, but even here they failed. In a few days, they never saw Drew take it out. Notably, the men's neighbors also could not recall seeing him with a garbage bag. The investigators then requested Chief Drew's assistance. The woman agreed to help them get something from his workplace that might contain a man's DNA. Her boss had been watching him for several days, but she never managed to get a single item. Drew rarely ate at work. I never threw anything out, and she couldn't find any hair on his desk. Considering the man had long hair, it seemed odd. Investigators were already convinced that Drew was deliberately covering his tracks to prevent them from getting his DNA. One day, the boss saw him tie his hair with a rubber band, after which he bent over and collected from the floor all the hair that fell in the process. After this, the woman decided to invite him for a lunch break at a cafe to allegedly discuss some of the working aspects. But here, too, the man was very careful. He mostly ate with his hands, put all the used tissues in his pocket, and even took a straw out of a drink. For dessert, they ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork. Except after that, he wiped it with a wet napkin for 15 minutes, excluding any possibility of taking a DNA sample from the device. Despite this, the investigators still took the plug and handed it to the laboratory. The lab was able to find tiny traces of DNA, and they showed a partial match to the DNA of Stephanie's killer. Except the results were too inaccurate, because a full comparison required more biological material. Eventually, the detectives got a warrant to search Drew's workplace. They were hoping that they might be able to find something there containing his DNA. But the investigators feared that the man would run if he knew about this search, so they decided to spend his evening time. Among the suspect's belongings were found gloves he was supposed to be using to handle chemicals. The detectives knew his DNA might be inside, so they took it and put another couple on it. They still feared that Drew might simply escape from their radar if he found out the police had his DNA. Forensics did find biological material inside the gloves, and DNA analysis showed a complete match. At last, the detectives were convinced that Drew was behind Stephanie Bennett's murder, and they had indisputable evidence on their hands. On 18 October 2005, the police quietly surrounded the lab where the man worked and waited for him to leave. The investigators feared that he might take a colleague hostage or attack them while attempting to arrest him inside the premises. These fears were not in vain. When the man came out of the building, his seam was twisted and he was carrying a loaded gun. Apparently, he knew perfectly well that the police were one step away from catching him and did not plan to surrender so easily. During the interrogation, which lasted more than 6 hours, Drew did not say a word. He refused to eat or drink or move. Eventually, the detective had to put him in a wheelchair to move around the precinct. After getting a warrant to search his apartment, investigators found a laundry basket stolen from Stephanie's house. In addition, there were 9 pistols, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a sword, and a machete. Among his belongings were also found a set of lockpicks and handcuffs. Detectives found a notebook with dozens of women's names. They immediately tracked them down to see if they were all right. Turns out, one of the women was the woman from his compound who complained about Drew during the interview. She said that a man was watching her on the street and she was not comfortable with his eyes. Her fears were confirmed. The police found this woman's underwear and tampons at Drew's house. There was also a copy of the tape from her high school graduation. It turned out that Drew broke into her apartment, took this tape, made a copy, and took the original back. All the while he kept these items, even after moving. They also found a check in his apartment for a woman who was murdered in 1999. Investigators discovered that at the time Drew lived in her town. Moreover, the woman was shot with a gun with a rather rare caliber, but that's the exact weapon that was found in the man's collection during the search. So Drew became a suspect in that case. But first he had to stand trial for Stephanie's murder. A month after his arrest, the prosecution officially announced that it would insist on the death penalty. The trial was scheduled to begin the following year, and Drew spent that time in solitary confinement, but the case never went to trial on January 1, 2006, when a man was found dead in the same cell. Despite all precautions, he managed to kill himself. The investigators had no doubt that it was Stephanie Bennett who killed him, but after the search of his house, an inevitable question arose. How many more victims this man could have had? At least he was very likely behind the murder of a woman in 1999. but the detectives were pretty sure Drew might have been involved in other crimes. After careful study of his biography, the police discovered several interesting points. Drew grew up with 3 brothers. Their father constantly humiliated and beat the children until their mother ran away with them to another state. Drew ended up being a very withdrawn teenager, and in the future, it only got worse. Despite this, he got a good education and got a decent job as a chemist. Colleagues said that he was very smart, but his social skills were almost non-existent. He had no friends at work. He did not communicate with anyone and always tried to stay as far away from the collective as possible. It is noteworthy that his brother Drew also had a criminal record. He was spying on women with a hidden camera. He got suspended. In 2008, Drew's mother sued the state government for allowing her son's death. However, the judge concluded that the prison officers had taken all the prescribed precautions and could not stop the man. Stephanie Bennett's father tried to sue the management of the housing complex for ignoring the residents' reports about the peeping man and for not paying enough attention to the safety of residents in their territory. In his opinion, in the dark near the houses, there was not enough light and anyone could walk there unnoticed. He also learned that the window in his daughter's apartment had been broken, but that the management of the complex was in no hurry to eliminate this problem. Although it was their direct duty, but ultimately the man himself refused these charges. No comment on his decision. So this complex and complicated case was eventually solved, but the cops are still asking how many more victims Drew might have had. All the available information indicates that the man was prone to serial crime. Only after his death, it became almost impossible to find out the truth. Share your opinion in the comments and do not forget to like under this video if you liked it. Also recommend subscribing to this channel. Thank you for watching.